Okay, so I think we wrapped up last time talking about Bitcoin as a weapon system, which is a really interesting discussion. Maybe we could recap a little bit of that before we segue in today's conversation.
Sure. So we started our first episode going into a mega deep dive into like what is life and why did it start and what does it mean and what makes life life. I actually, after that conversation, I went to this bookstore. I bought this book. It's called Very Short History of Life on Earth by Henry Gee. And I bought it because on the first page, it talks about the beginning of life. And listen to this sentence. It's talking about how life basically started as a bunch of bubbles in rock. He said, "These simple bubbles found themselves at the very gates of life, and that they found a way to halt, if temporarily and with great effort, the otherwise inexorable increase in entropy, the net amount of disorder in the universe. Such is an essential property of life. These foamy lathers of soap bubble cells stood as tiny clenched fists, defiant against a lifeless world." And I was totally blown away by that quote, because that is essentially exactly what our conversation was, down to the part where the role of life is to defy the entropy of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Clenched fists. So, it's great because, this idea of power projection is in a lot of ways, and the story of power projection is in a lot of ways a story of the cruelty of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Another way to say kinetic power projection, in sometimes kinetic power projection is just straight up violence. It's animals eating other animals, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there is, again, you have to put on your sociopath hat and look at life through the lens of nature, through the lens of physics. There is clearly merit to that game in some circumstances. And the main one that I can see is that permissionless part that we mentioned. And so that was pretty much the story of episode 1, was through kinetic power projection, life is able to achieve a permissionless, trustless control structure over limited resources. And in this struggle, set a pecking order where the strongest bubble to the top emerge as, the strongest get more resources, get to stay at the top of the pecking order. And you want that because life is defiance against the inevitable entropy of the universe, the harsh disorder of the universe. So you need your fittest to be the most equipped to countervail the entropy of nature.
Love
life,
that.
Yeah. And so like this, I say this word all the time. It's like a meme now on Twitter, but countervalence is really important to understand for 2 reasons. One, what I just mentioned, because it's basically what life is.
Mm-hmm.
That's like what makes life life. If you want to see the difference between an inanimate, non-lifeless, or like a lifeless thing versus a life thing, the life thing is the one that's countervailing entropy.
Yes.
But the other one is this entire concept, fast forwarding to the end of episode 1, is this entire concept of ownership itself. Can you claim to own anything if you do not have a mechanism to countervail the control authority over property? I know that's kind of weird, but like,
to countervail the claims of others on it, right? To defend it.
Yeah, because the alternative to that game is trust, to trust your neighbor.
Right.
Okay. And, especially the Bitcoiners, a popular theme that comes up with the Bitcoiners that they should understand really well is the security flaw of trust, right? Of the problem with trust at scale. So if you, like, let's say me and you came to an agreement over that stake. Okay. We'll just say it's your stake and we'll carry on. You have to trust that I will honor that agreement. If you don't have the option to countervail me, even if I agree to let you think you own the stake. So another way to say it is, the lesson here is what you see as you go into the cave on Pirates of the Caribbean and the Disney ride, right? When you walk in, you've got that like pirate that says dead men tell no tales, right? You know what dead men also don't do? They don't break their promises, right? They don't. So, if you don't want to worry, like the lion doesn't have to worry about anything breaking their promise over his claim to territory because he doesn't need their promises. Dead animals don't break promises. Dead men don't break promises. I don't have to worry that you'll rat me out or you'll turn on me later if I can just succeed at the kinetic power projection game, which might not require death. It's not all like, that bad, but like, we don't have to worry that we don't have to trust or rely on China not to break a promise so long as we have the power projection capability to impose a prohibitive cost on their breaking their promise. And through that game, pecking order is established. It's an existential necessity for that to be established. And through that game, the fittest, both in strength, but also in intelligence, arise at the top. And then we talked about all the different types of strategies that emerged, the most effective one being the colonization attack, where life forms essentially just build really nice, thick, strong membranes and grow and become trees and become 80% of the biomass on Earth. And you can look at that as a, quote, defense strategy because they're not actively maneuvering, but it's not really, because when you grow, like if you focus on defense, but you grow and then you capture territory and you capture territory and then 80% of that's an offensive, right? That's what people would call offensive if you want to use that framework. But the other way to do it is what became animals, the thin membranes where they try to outmaneuver each other. And those things focused a lot more on finding increasingly clever ways to outmaneuver each other and be more intelligent. So have you ever noticed how trees don't have brains? And have you ever thought to yourself, like, why don't they? It's because they don't need them. Brains are like what you need if you need to outthink and outmaneuver your opponent. That's something for animals to do. A tree with a really thick trunk and deep roots doesn't need to think or outmaneuver because it's a tree. Like, until humans came along with chainsaws, there was no defeating a tree or with an axe, right? Like the tree, the trees in the Sahara don't care about the apex mammals, right? They're not strong enough to break their membranes. So why do you even need a brain? Why do you even need eyeballs? Why do you need teeth? Trees have none of those things. And another so we talked a whole bunch about like all these different power projection strategies, increasingly clever ones.
Can I jump in here? The useful definition that came to me through our discussions, and I think I got this from another book as well, but the idea of defining life as that which imports energy and exports entropy. So this does a number of things. It implies that there's a membrane, right? There's some layer that within which is that which is alive, and without which is what is being combated against or countervailed, I guess, to use your favorite term. And so in this dynamic, there is a utility of violence. That's what animals are doing when they eat plants or eat each other, right? They're basically commandeering the work of another strategy, another species, or even of the same species, another animal, another organism, where they're consuming, right, whatever energy has been imported into that strategy, whether this is sunlight into a tree or the grass into a cow, whatever. You're now basically commandeering that energy to fund your own little economy, where you're importing their energy and exporting entropy. So I think that's really interesting that because life is really hard to define. And the quote you opened with, where it emerged originally as, I guess, these are basically bubbles, right? Or little,
yeah. So
little
he calls
suds or foam is kind of what I'm imagining.
Yeah, he literally calls them. He says the earliest living things were no more than scummy membranes across microscopic gaps in rocks.
Mm.
And to your point, he even says it. He talks about these membranes were porous. They made virtue of their leakiness, using holes as gateways for energy and nutrients and as exit points for wastes. So their membrane was able to allow energy and nutrients into the membrane, into the bubble, and entropy, waste, right, that disorder out.
And this is a selective permeability, right? Or something. Mm-hmm. I think that's the term. And we still have that. That's in the cells of organisms. Each cell wall is selectively permeable. It takes in food and it exports waste. I just wanted to point out here that definition of life, like an open system that imports energy and exports entropy, that really broadens the scope of what's alive. Because now all of a sudden, like, well, a city does that, a business does that, a nation state does that. So all these things are kind of like organisms in their own way. And that definition of life emerging as bubbles, like that's also in my study of how states emerge. That's how they emerge. They emerge as these little protected economic enclaves, right? Someone, the big guy or big guys, established a territorial boundary and said, inside of this
is my membrane.
This is our membrane. This is our territory. All the commerce that occurs within this territory, I get a cut of it, right? Which is taxation or tribute. And anyone that tries to come into that membrane that's not welcome, we will project power to countervail their efforts.
Yeah.
So just wanted to highlight that as like, this is a very universal discussion. It's not just flesh and bone organic species we're talking about here. These are all open systems that are importing energy, exporting entropy.
Yeah. One more quote from him is, even though they were porous, so he's referring to these membranes, the environment inside the membranes became different from the raging maelstrom beyond, calmer and more ordered. So to your point, when we started talking about agrarian society, we framed it as a bubble happening right around the rivers or right around the areas where they were able to start irrigating land. Mm-hmm. In the middle of the giant Eurasian bloodbath that was nature at the time, right? Mm-hmm. All their neighbors are pretty brutal. And so these people, when they formed these first societies, they were forming another layer of order beyond that which existed before. And that is what life is. It's this whole stack, and it's extremely unclear where to actually draw the boundary, because if, at scale, at a holistic level, you look like Robert, I look like Jason, we appear at scale to be distinct, a single living organism. But if I look at you through a microscope, it's a totally different, that's a city in itself. And if I keep on going deeper, and the same is true for the other way. So if we zoom out, like imagine if aliens came to visit Earth, what would they see? Like, what would they just describe what they would see? They would see all sorts of different animals, but if they were to like describe what a country was, they would say, oh, look, there's these different pools of creatures that are all engaging in a brute force power competition against each other to effectively establish a pecking order over these different resources that are limited on this planet. And especially for nations themselves, if you look at it holistically, we are 195 different pools of power projectors that are all doing this brute force competition specifically to prevent any other pool from achieving 51% control over the limited resources of Earth. So like what scale, the difference between centralization and decentralization and all these concepts that we talk about kind of change depending on what scale you look at it. But what's always true is there is a boundary, and inside the boundary is order and different self-assembling proteins defying the chaos of the universe. And then outside of that bubble is the Maelstrom.
Yeah, it's a great point. And then the visual I have here too is, we have 100, like you said, 195-ish of these economic bubbles or membranes, all trying to have a profitable balance of, net energy importation. So importing energy minus exporting entropy, they're in profit basically. But this insinuates that there is antagonism between them, right? Because they're all exporting entropy onto one another effectively. And that's the contention. So I guess one way of thinking about Bitcoin is like it's a new protocol or order beneath which all of these organizations would be forming themselves, and it would reduce the need for, in particular, as we get into kinetic warfare between these little bubbles. I wanted to add here too. So that idea where you said the enclave started along the river where we would irrigate land. The thought I had about this is in those enclaves, you're essentially increasing the amount of energy that's being harnessed, mostly from the sun, but also from water and whatnot through agriculture. So that buildup of economic surplus or energy collection, that becomes an incentive for outsiders to invade, right? So the cell membrane is an absolute necessity, because if you don't have it, then whatever you work to create, outsiders are just going to come and harvest. So there's a positive correlation between the need for defense and the amount of energy being imported.
And from the sociopath perspective, it makes sense. Like you created this juicy target with abundance of energy. Like, of course it's going to be targeted. Well, why would this 4 billion year old game of life stop right at, the emergence of agrarian society,
right?
And this human invented concept of, quote, like morals, like, oh, it's, we're predators. You have to know your roots.
Yes.
Right?
Which this gets to the economics of force itself, right? It will always be targeted so long as there's energy there. But if the defense is adequate, then the cost benefit for the attacker is out of favor, right? If they can't penetrate the defense, then they're going to go elsewhere because they can't do it profitably or at all. So there's this real deep concept of defending property economically that sort of contributes to civilization.
And the trail of life's evolution, if we pick apart all the major ones that kind of took life to the, from a foamy bubble to me and you talking on Zoom, each one of those major evolutions can be viewed through the lens of increasingly clever ways to project power. And if you study those really carefully, you see some major ones. You see things like cooperation becoming a very effective strategy, not because of morals, but because you can sum power together.
Yes.
So cooperation is a predatory tactic. That's why lions hunt together in packs. Or we didn't talk about it, but this concept of death, of limited lifespans. What's the word again?
Senescence.
Senescence. Okay. So scientists can actually reproduce this phenomenon. You put yeast in a bowl or you spin it around, you give it enough time, eventually the genetics will mutate to the point where the membranes are sticky and these bubbles get stuck together. And this gets back to our first episode where the first examples of cooperation as a predatory tactic happened involuntarily. They didn't know what they were doing. It was a mutation for these animals. They just literally just clustered and stuck together. They were forced to be cooperative because they had no option. But what's even cooler is if you allow these sticky cells to cluster together, eventually they'll hit a mutation where they have limited lifespan. They actually have like this little ticking time bomb that clicks, and after a certain time frame, boom, the cell dies. And that'll force these clusters of yeast to split. And now you become two different, distinct bubble boundaries, right? Membranes, I guess, like, multicellular creatures. But even more so, remember this whole discussion that we talked about entrepreneurialism and the imperative to change or die because the environment is changing or dying. With what the animals figured out is you can actually cycle through more features. Like you can test out more competitive strategies by hard coding a limited lifespan into each of these cells. It literally forces them to change. It literally forces the old dogs who can't learn new tricks to go away so that the new dogs have a chance to test new features in a production environment and in nature. So by having limited lifespans, you actually are able to cycle through more features in a production environment to learn faster what works and what doesn't. And some branch off and are complete failures. And they're just like, you get like the platypus and you're just like, what the hell was that? Like, how, or you get like a manatee and you're just like, okay, that thing definitely not gonna, like, I don't know how it's not extinct yet. But you also get eyeballs, you get teeth, you get camouflage, you get thumbs, you get prefrontal cortexes, you get all these things, right? And so, have you ever, we talked about earlier, have you noticed how trees don't have brains? Have you noticed how trees don't really have lifespans? Like the oldest animals the oldest living creatures in the world are the plants. they didn't need to what is it called? Senescence. I never remember the word.
Senescence.
They didn't need senescence as a competitive strategy because, again, a tiger can't cut down a tree. Like, they're strong as hell.
Yeah.
But for the animal size, they do. And so animals have significantly shorter lifespans than their colonizing competitors in plants.
Right.
So to recap everything, is aging is a power projection strategy. It forces the species as a whole to continue to try new things in order to become the dominant predator, essentially, in the environment.
Yeah, brilliant. You said one thing that jumps out at me here is this whole idea that really, so sexual reproduction, right? Every generation, you're remixing the genes and combinations of genes to test new features, basically. You also have death. So that's also increasing the number of features that are being tested, as you said. I think the underlying dynamic here is the intensity of exchange, right? That it actually makes more exchanges at the genetic level occur, right? The fact that you have to sexually reproduce and you die and there's new sets of genes being tested in the environment means there's more exchange happening. And we know through like a praxeological lens, the more free exchange in a marketplace, the more wealth is being created. So this is like, it's a wealth creation strategy at a genetic or biological level. And then I guess you could carry it further and say the reason humans are so dominant is because we've extended that beyond our own biology, right? We've increased the intensity of exchange through an economic process. So we now are able to test, exponentially more features and their fittedness to our purposes in the environment. And a lot of that is through the things we talked about last time, like shared abstractions, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why we're the dominant species, right? Because we have a greater intensity of exchange, creating more wealth, even beyond our own biological algorithm.
Yeah. Because we have these like really badass computers in our heads, we can run this software, and software isn't these ideas. Like, we can form these ideas, which aren't limited by physics, they aren't limited by like mass.
Yeah.
So we can actually think of more different things to try faster than biology can like change genetic code to try new features.
Right.
And we can build stuff faster than genetics can build stuff. And as a result of us being able to try new features in a production environment to essentially capture more energy and dump more entropy, it's no surprise that we've slaughtered we've wrecked everyone around us, because we're just using the same strategies that life already has proven are
just
effective. Just faster.
Yeah.
And at larger scale.
Yeah, it's mind blowing. And the historical record bears that out, right? Everywhere man goes, there's like, we slaughter all the animals, we start cutting down trees, like we really physically conquer the environment.
Yeah, you can. I don't remember, like maybe it was 2 million years ago. I don't remember all my anthropology, but like once, humans became like distinctly human, and there was all those different types of humans, like the sapiens, Neanderthals, or whatever, you can see in the record that the average size of mammals decreased by 10x. Like, right? Because we went around killing everything. It wasn't just sapiens. It was like everybody. But by the time 10,000 years ago, where we kind of just stopped slaughtering everything, it was largely because we slaughtered everything. Like we got to the point where we had overhunted, and we, some of it was because we needed to we needed to genetically enslave RX, because all these other different types of animals aren't around anymore. And it's like, oh crap, if we don't figure out a new clever way to harvest their energy, then we're not going to have anything. We're not going to have any meat left.
Right.
And also, and it's kind of unclear who's genetically altering who, but when we talk about irrigation, not only are we domesticating animals, but we're also domesticating like plants too. So like an orange isn't a natural, like that didn't exist before humans started irrigation. Bananas didn't exist. Like these are things that we literally created, like, you know, the wiener dog.
Yeah. Artificial selection versus natural selection, right?
Yeah, that's the kind way of saying it. Artificial selection, where humans are selecting by, yeah.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services, or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. You know, irrigation is such an apt analogy because there's an excellent book by Dawkins titled A River Out of Eden. And he describes genetics as a river through time. So species are each a channel or flow of genetic information across time, and it can branch into other species and whatnot. But that's essentially what humans are doing, right? We're redirecting this flow of genetic information towards the orange that tastes good and away from the orange that doesn't, or towards the cute wiener dog and away from the wolf, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Like we're consciously directing the flow of genetics across time.
Yeah. And it, you know, as bloody as that has been, there's clear, like it's clearly working. Like we've left the planet and we've begun to colonize other bodies in the universe. Like we've hit, you know, we've walked people on the moon, and we've got rovers on virtually every planet in the solar system now. So like we're clearly doing good at doing well at starting to countervail the entropy of the universe, because it's like we're planting, like there's an American flag on the moon right now. Like it's working. And so, you know, like we have to understand the imperative of this dog eat dog world that we live in, because, you know, the alternative is you let unfit life have all the resources, and we don't get to plant the flag on the moon.
Right. There's something about subduing lower levels, right? Whether it's inorganic reality or lower levels of biological reality, that promotes our own freedom, right? We've subdued or genetically enslaved a lot of plants, as you've described. We've domesticated a lot of animals. Well, that's like the energy foundation on which we stand, right? We still benefit from that today. Every time you go to the grocery store, you're benefiting from that.
And it's not, we also rely on it too. So it's not like we're just killing everything and burning everything. We're restructuring it to be more in order at our whatever level of the membrane you want to consider it. So inside the city or inside this country is just, it's not death. It's just more ordered and more structured life.
Yes. And this is like clearly everything we're laying out here. It's like essential to the story of humanity becoming what we are today. But there is this dangerous line that gets crossed, and we've crossed it plenty of times throughout human history, where we're like, okay, we're subduing plants and animals, but we also subdue one another, right? We've had many institutions of slavery throughout history, and that one, it can contribute to economic efforts in the short run, but as technology advances, labor becomes a smaller component of the cost structure. And further, there's very clear moral implications. This idea of, really the idea of all men are created equal, right? That's an idea. That's a psychotechnological update, or a shared abstraction under which we're still trying to organize ourselves 250 years later. But I just wanted to point that out, that there is clearly is a very useful strategy, this subduing process, but it can be taken too far into a domain that's morally questionable or even reprehensible.
But also, when we get into those bad situations, look at how we got out of those bad situations. It was through the projection of power to countervail the control authority of the dominant control authority. So the point is, you have to, if you do not have the mechanism to countervail control authority, you are not free. You are not living either.
Right.
By the definition of life being the ability to, rebel against the entropy of the universe. If you are totally victim to that, which is what is the problem with proof of stake, which we can get into later. But if you have no mechanism to countervail, if you have no mechanism to kill the king, then you can't claim to be free, and you can't claim to own anything either,
right?
Because you have to trust. Yeah, you have to trust the other person. And like if they just choose to not let you have access to it, then you have no, you just have to accept it. Like you've got no leverage, right? There has to be, and really it ultimately seems to largely be technological. Like I'm thinking about when the knight on horseback was the law of the land for a long time, until we invented gunpowder. So then all of a sudden the knight on horseback that could contend with 20 peasants in armed combat, now a single peasant could take out the knight from 200 yards with a rifle. So all of a sudden, this little innovation of gunpowder gave the peasant the ability to countervail the willpower of the knight on horseback. Yeah. And also, like if we get to before gunpowder, the great thing, and I know I sound like a sociopath, but I have to, in order to, you have to because what we're talking about right now is proof of work.
Yeah.
Once you understand the role of power projection, the role of violence, the role of and the necessity to be able to countervail control authority, you realize that there is no substitute for proof of work. There will never be a substitute for proof of work. And so to understand how life can scale to the point where a multiplanetary species, we have to, like, if we want to predict how the future is going, we have to predict what shape and what form proof of work will take in the future. And Bitcoin is probably going to be it. But before we get there, the cool thing about this night game is that, like, the rich guy is equally as vulnerable to a sword in the heart as the poor person. So there is a meritocracy in this power projection game. The slave with a sword is pretty close to the same as the soldier with a sword. In fact, one of the most common ways of growing up the ladder within an agrarian society is to go from the farmer or the person at the bottom to the person holding the sword and wielding it effectively. So, the rich guy who gets shot through the face with a bullet is the same as the poor guy who gets shot in the face with the bullet. Like, they're equal. And so in this game, this power projection game, there is not a imbalance. It's not unfair.
It's ruthlessly egalitarian.
It is, yeah, it's honest. Nature is a very honest judge. Yeah, ruthlessly egalitarian is a great way of putting it. And if you don't have that ability, then you have to consider, okay, what are the alternatives? And the alternatives are always, well, they're not what people intrinsically or instinctively believe as fair, or they require trust.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And there's something about here with trust, ethos and Bitcoin, don't trust, verify. I guess you could say too, that if you can just trust someone's self-interest, right? If you know the incentives they face, then all of a sudden you don't really need to trust them so much. You're trusting something beneath them even. You're trusting, the incentives that shape their behavior. So, as we said earlier, trust doesn't necessarily scale in society. So what do we need to do? We need to create systems that align individual self-interest with, I guess, these collective protocols that are, sort of universally fair, kind of mirroring this ruthlessly egalitarian situation you're saying. So we have a rule of law that applies equally to all. Like that's a useful technology, right? Or property rights that apply to all. That's a useful technology. But I guess the trap we've always been in is the enforcer of those rules also has an incentive to abdicate from those rules or remake the rules in their own favor. And that's what we've been struggling with.
Yeah. And when that happens, you get a larger, like, to defeat that is to cooperate at larger scale, or to project power in a more clever way. And as a result of that power projection and mass cooperation, you get more order at scale. So it gets back to the ultra society thesis in philanthropy, where the most advanced, you can measure how much animals cooperate with each other. Like, you can measure it by the amount of time that they spend building something together. So a bee, to how much do bees cooperate at scale? Well, you measure how many bee hours it takes to build a beehive. How much do ants cooperate at scale? Measure how many ant hours it requires to build a colony or whatever they build. If you compare what you think are massive cooperators, like you see these massive ant colonies, and you're just like, wow, they can cooperate at such large scales. That's nothing compared to what humans can do. If you measure human hours required to build a pyramid, or human hours required to build an ISS, the International Space Station, it dwarfs the ant colony. And then if you measure individual societies across history, right? What are they? Look at the temple that they built and how many hours it took to build that temple. You'll see a direct correlation. Those civilizations that are cooperating at the largest scale, to putting the most hours to build a single thing, build a single temple, are the ones that are warring. Those are the ones that are best at war. Those are the Romans. Those are the Ottomans. They're the United Kingdom. They're Genghis Khan, right? They're the Egyptians. And so, it's like, yes, we get these problems from time to time where people try to abuse their power projection capability. But so long as we maintain the ability to countervail them, you don't have to worry. And that was where we were up until the point where we improve the operational effectiveness, we call it, of war, to the point where we get to nukes. And then it's like, oh crap, there is no way to countervail the control authority of a nuclear armed state without risking mutual annihilation and destruction of the species. and life all of a sudden just hits a stopping point, you get, we by the way, when the United States had nukes, we effectively 51% attacked the world with our brute force power projection capability. So USSR had to just focus all their attention on nukes so we could at least get out of that 51% attack. And now we've got multiple nuclear powers. So no one single nuclear power has full control or authority over all the stuff. But we've now hit a what is effectively a stalemate still. And how, like, it gets straight back to what we talked about earlier. If you can't countervail a nuclear state, are you free? Do you actually own the thing? And so if you're a country that's like, a North Korea, what do they care about? They care about getting to nukes as fast as possible, so that at least they could be at countervalence parity with the other top dogs. And so we're just in such a dangerous situation at a macroscopic level. And so life has to figure out a way to turn. And it's not the first time that a species has reached a point where they have to evolve a new brute force power competition capability that doesn't risk extinction of the species. That's what antlers are. They grow protrusions out of their faces, and then they fight each other, still in a kinetic power projection capability, but in what is usually a non-lethal competition. And the winner of that competition gets the mayor or the territory or whatever. It's not just antlers. There's like bugs that do this too. And they're not even always antlers. It's, you look at birds, like birds of paradise, and they're just funny. Like, look at a peacock. Look at that power projection competition. Like, right. Like, that's an interesting one. It's non-lethal, and they use that as the mechanism to establish intra-speceil pecking order. So humans are now at a point where we must, if we want to continue to live in a free place where the individual sovereign can claim to own anything without having to trust, then we have to find an intra-speceil surrogate competition. And that's really what makes Bitcoin so profound, is because at the systemic or at the physics level, it is still joules per second. Like, instead of putting bullets down a cylinder with gunpowder, you put electricity down the barrel of a miner and you fire it at another mining pool, and you agree that whoever wins that competition earns the underlying digital property. And you've reestablished a protocol that allows for countervalence, meaning I don't have to worry about a single, I guess you say, you don't have to worry about, there's 100% probability that the top power projectors can be impeached. Or I guess there's 0% probability that the top power projectors can't be impeached. So as long as you have the mechanism to kill the king, as long as you have a mechanism to impeach the control authority of the top power projectors, then you can claim to be in a, quote, fair or free system. If you don't have that mechanism, then it's trust-based and it's not free. You just are counting on the benevolence of the people who are in control of the property.
Yeah, that's so well said. And I guess what I'm seeing here is like this power projection is so fundamental. I mean, it is the most fundamental aspect of existence and physical reality as a biological organism. something like that. And we hit a stalemate with nukes, right? Because you can't push that game any further without mutually assured destruction, as you said. So it's almost like Bitcoin is absolutely essential. You need an alternative channel for the power projection game, for these energies that course through us. Like, we all have a competitive instinct, at least to some extent. You want to go out into the world and do things. There's some competition implied in that. So Bitcoin mining then becomes this new outlet for these natural competitive Darwinian energies.
What is essential is what we call today proof of work. We need an alternative mechanism to engage in power projection, to have a competition, a fair competition. Remember, what makes it fair is the rich person suffers the same as the poor person when they get hit in the face with a bullet. Mm-hmm. So you need to have a fair joules per second versus joules per second competition, the winner of which earns the right to set the state and chain of custody of an underlying resource that you both mutually depend on. And so this is where, like, when Level 39 found the Tesla article, The Problem of Scaling Human Energy, written in 1900, somewhere around the turn of the century, Tesla predicted this exact thing. He predicted that humans would improve the operational effectiveness of warfare to the point where he predicted basically death laser beams. The whole entire planet would be covered with these beams that could just destroy, it would be impenetrable, basically. It would make it impossible to invade a country because they have these death rays. But the point is, he envisioned he envisioned a stalemate. Right? They would reach a point where humans were so good at this game that we would achieve a stalemate. It came through nukes. He never lived to see the first nuclear weapon go off, but because of that stalemate, he predicted that the humans would have to turn to machines fighting machines in an energy competition to settle disputes, to reestablish a permissionless control structure over an underlying property.
Right.
And then 20 years after that, Edison and Ford are saying, hey, the solution to war is we stop monetizing gold, but we start monetizing energy. And so he's going to the plant to try to set up try to start this new idea of energy money. So these top dogs of the American Industrial Revolution were already forecasting 100 years ago that we would reach a stalemate, that we would need to monetize energy, and that the future of warfare would be machine versus machine energy competitions. So proof of work, they all predicted proof of work and energy money. They didn't have the technology quite mature enough to make it work yet. Then the question becomes, okay, so proof of work is clearly a way that you can resolve the stalemate and restore permissionless control over property so that intra-specially we can continue this power projection game that is essential for nominating the strongest up to the top and countervailing the entropy of the universe. But it wasn't clear what that would be. Would it be Bitcoin or would it be some other proof of work coin? You can't know what it would be. So then the question is, all right, let's just assume it does make sense. The future of warfare will be machines versus machines. They're going to improve operational effectiveness of warfare way more so than humans. Having a human in the loop in the future is going to be the limiting factor. right? Like humans have no chance at competing against AI drone cluster fights like that. That's going to have to be a human out of the loop fight where we just let them engage, and then we just agree that whoever wins that fight. But would it be Bitcoin? Does it, like, what would it be? And so the question is, how would you know it if you see it? Like, if you know that the future of evolution and scaling of cooperation amongst human beings is going to be some type of proof of work, power projection game, an electric one, probably in the digital domain, because that's the one that's resilient to nukes. What would it look like? It would be made out of technology that's nuclear hardened, which is what TCP/IP is, and the internet is. That's why it was created. And then you realize, okay, well, whatever that future proof of work protocol for war fighting is, like whatever that's going to be, is just going to be the most adopted one. Like whatever the most people agree to is the future of proof of work fighting. And that's already Bitcoin by like many, many orders of magnitude. Like you can measure the proof of the amount of energy that is being fired through the barrel of all the miners combined on the Bitcoin network versus on some other proof of work chain. And Bitcoin dwarfs it by like, 100,000 or something.
Yeah.
So that you, because, I get accused of being a maxi all the time. I don't identify as a Bitcoin maxi. I identify as a proof of work maxi. If the future of warfare is going to be the power projection game that most people agree to play, that's already Bitcoin. It's already happening right now, right in front of us. And so all I think is going to happen is that's going to continue to be the thing. Yes. Why? Because these idiots are these other idiots are thinking that this is like, an ESG problem and pivoting away from proof of work. Like the most important thing is the proof of work. And that's labeled as like a bad thing now. And people are pivoting away. And it's like, holy crap, we've got the strategic corner in the market now. Bitcoin has such a huge lead. And I don't know of any way that it's going to go away at this point.
Yeah. And this is such a crucial point for explaining, why Bitcoin, not any other coin, because people are choosing voluntarily to play this Bitcoin game, to hold Bitcoin relative to all other coins, because the properties that it's rendering to them, the services it's rendering to them, it's already optimized for holders, right? And this is why I always talk about the properties of money. Divisibility, durability, recognizability, portability, scarcity. In particular, with a fixed supply, it's like it's perfect. There's no unexpected inflation. What else could you want in a store of value? Something that's a perfectly fixed supply and has credibly resisted the attempted countervailing efforts of others. If you go study the block wars from 2017, there was an attempt to countervail and co-opt this Bitcoin game, and it failed. So Bitcoin has these battle scars. It kind of proves its sufficiency, I guess, at remaining what it sets out to be. Can I ask you one here? You mentioned TCP/IP is nuclear hardened. I just was wondering if you could expand upon that a little bit.
Yeah. So back in the day, we have different command centers across the United States. These were the first major ones were basically strategically vital. They were the command centers that launched nukes. And so you had to build redundancy between these centers. And so the first intranets
where all the Stratcom, nuclear command and control, defense like the nuclear communication networks for the United States, so that if Russia shoots first and hits Cheyenne Mountain or hits some major comm center, it's decentralized network. It won't destroy the whole network. So you have to be able to preserve comms and also synchronize comms across massive geographic distance in order to preserve nuclear resilience during a nuclear strike. Otherwise, you're screwed. So that became DARPANET. So by the way, what am I saying? I'm saying because of the threat of death, right? Because of war, we started creating increasingly clever ways to do stuff, which became a big deal beyond just war. Like civilization now is thriving because of the invention of these intranets. The problem came, well, like how do you connect other intranets to this computer if they're using totally different comm protocols? And so you get to the same problem that we're having with Bitcoin, which is there's all these different types of networks. We need one network to rule them all. And so DARPA was just like, or the military was just like, okay, it's going to be TCP/IP because that's what we have. And they forced it down the entire military's throats. And the military was the technology leader at the time. And so TCP/IP emerged as what became the intranet, the protocol through which computers talk to each other. And it's not the first time a military has created a common protocol. This happens a lot, actually, in history. Another really common example is the Roma-WIA, the Roman road network that the Roman legion started. Back in the day, the easiest way to get supplies, to include military logistical supplies, was port to port. If you look at Italy, it's like a really great, it's like really skinny. And so you can get from one port to the other port. And it's actually like a really good way to get to cross ports if you develop a road network on land to support it. But the problem is, well, what's the common, like what size road should we build? Like what is the common protocol for the wagons that we're going to haul? And so the Roman legion was like, okay, from now on, a road will be this wide, and the tracks in the road where it's smooth to allow for like wheels will be this wide. And they created a wheel-based protocol and said, if we want to connect this port to this port, then we must use this common wheel-based protocol. And so all wagons were designed to have the exact same wheel-based protocol. And it's basically the width between two horses' asses. If you put them next to each other, like if you're pulling something, it's basically the width, like the tail width between the tails of horses is the common width of a wheelbase. Well, that is good for logistics because now you can create common packets. You can transpose freight in a common wheelbase protocol. They started connecting more roads. As they connected more roads, Metcalfe's law takes off. You've created a mesh network, a common road network to connect ports to each other. Again, we're talking, it's the same. You've created an intranet. Yeah. So what happens for countries outside and they want to connect to the Roman ports to do trade? Well, it's in their best interest to adopt the same protocol the Romans started. Right. So they all adopt the same wheel-based protocol. And so now today, if you go to visit the ancient ruins of Rome and you measure that wheel-based protocol, the tracks down the roads that was started by the Roman legion, it happens to be the exact width of every railway in the world, which happens to be the width that governs the form factor of every shipping container in the world, which happens to be, the form factor that governed the width of, most of the pieces on the ISS. So common protocols are kind of a big deal.
they start as an existential necessity of winning this power projection game over pecking order, whether it be a wheel-based protocol, whether it be a internet protocol, whether it be a 120 volt outlet in your house, whether it be what's the future proof of work, electric warfighting protocol, right? Like it's pretty interesting how these networks emerge.
That's super cool. The U.S. interstate system, I think, too, was deployed by the military. So it seems to be a recurrent pattern.
Yeah, it's common for new technologies to emerge from the R&D labs of militaries, because usually that R&D is not really cost effective for like a business. It's changed a lot recently in the last 40 years, where a lot of the new badass bleeding edge tech is coming from private labs, not from the military. But if you zoom out and look at agrarian society as a whole, there's a tendency for new technology to emerge through the necessity of warfighting, and then, or mature fastest through the necessity of warfighting before going into the public. Protocols being one of the most pervasive and underappreciated, in my opinion.
Yes. Yeah, it's super interesting. And it's somewhat, Sailor made the point about, I guess it was, Carnegie effectively monopolizing the steel industry, and, just in a natural monopoly, but he established these protocols, right? Like, I don't know all the details, but I guess the size and dimensions of the beam and all of that. And then
how
eventually
much carbon is in each unit of steel.
Yeah. And if the network footprint, I guess, is sufficient, that it becomes a Schelling point, basically, right? And the whole market then adapts to these protocols. So it's interesting. It's almost like you need centralization to establish the protocol, but then the protocol accelerates decentralization, because all of the economic efficiency created by it, passes wealth out into the network. So there's an interesting interplay between centralized decision making and then decentralized wealth creation.
Yeah, the centralization. What is centralization? Centralization is people cooperating together at larger scales, or it is one of the mechanisms of power projection, centralized command and control, or a bunch of people working in one direction. And so it's really the threat of, we'll call it war for agrarian society, but it's the need for defense drives the need to centralize and cooperate. And there's that tension there, if that makes sense.
Yeah.